You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I'm the host, writer, editor, all of the things. And over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point, but we also get the whole picture to fully explore the nature versus nurture aspect of these people who commit these horrible crimes. If you're into that, cool, because that's what we do over here. Subscribe, like, follow, let the ads play, every bit helps. Everything's in the notes below. So this week's podcast will be on Casey Anthony. Now, listen, okay? For those that voted no, your groans are palpable. I hear you. I did a legitimate poll, and it was a resounding yes, that like 95% of you wanted me to cover her. And you know that I will do my upper best to come at it from a fresh or different angle so that it's not the same story you've heard over and over. And I also promised some smartassery, some snark. And so you shall have it. It goes without saying that this is about the murder of beautiful little toddler Kaylee Anthony. And even though every single one of us knows it was a bullshit verdict, her deadbeat mother, Casey, was found innocent. She's already threatened defamation lawsuits for people like me if we talk shit. So for the sake of all of that crap, everything I say in this is allegedly. Allegedly. There will most likely also be a lot more swearing on my part in this because this lady child makes my blood absolutely boil, and the more angry I am, the more foul my mouth. So if that will be too much, well, I apologize in advance. And now that Casey is back on everyone's radar as of late due to her attempting to join society again via TikTok, most of you wanted a refresher. So her joining TikTok got every person on that app in a tizzy, and they even invoked witch talk. That shit was wild. I've shared some people's videos where they are disgusted that she even showed her face again. My country, currently so divided, and yet we all came together to tell her to fuck right off. It made me so proud. So you all know that the new podcasts and the videos are going to start coming out about her again, and though I do loathe joining any bandwagon, I might as well make this for you so that at least you can hear it from me, who is your favorite. Admit it, it's okay. Ready? So here we go. Since we do mostly psychological stuff over here, and I don't really remember much about Casey's childhood, let's go all the way back and see what we can find, if anything. So Casey Marie Anthony was born on March 19th, 1986 in Warren, Ohio, to her parents George and Cindy Anthony. Warren is in sort of the upper northeast corner of Ohio, not too terribly far from the Pennsylvania border. So let's get into some family history because there is some stuff there, guys. Let's say all the way back to Casey's maternal great-grandfather, her mother Cindy's grandfather, who was a man who had actually immigrated to the U.S. from Romania. He got over here, he settled, I don't know if he came as a child or what, but once he was grown, he married an American woman, and they went on to have a number of children. I couldn't find the exact number, but a handful. Alexander, Casey's maternal grandfather, her mother Cindy's father, was the youngest of those children. And when Alexander's mother died suddenly, but from what I don't know, Alexander's father placed all of his children in an orphanage. Now, I get that that would be difficult to raise kids as a single father, but still, he dumped his kids off because he didn't want to take care of them. Now, from what I read, the other siblings might have been adopted. I couldn't find out specifically. However, Alexander was never adopted. That was stated quite plainly. He aged out. So imagine what that must have been like, right? I think he was around 3 years old when his mother died, and he was dumped into an orphanage basically alone. And there's no need to get into how awful some orphanages, and especially back then, were. Abuse, neglect, constant bullying, on and on. We can feel quite confident that this would have affected him negatively. Alexander dropped out of high school. He joined the Navy and he served bravely during World War II. And then when that was over, he served during the Korean War. But before he joined the military and just before he left high school, he met Shirley Marie Giddings, right? So her family had all hailed from that general area for a few generations. So someone who basically had never had any real family began dating a girl who had a lot of family. Alexander and Shirley married and went on to have 4 children, 3 boys, and then finally a girl. There was a little bit of an age spread between the children, but their father had gone off to war, so allowances can be made. Sources said that once Shirley and Alexander got married and began having their children, they didn't really have much to do with Shirley's family. Casey Anthony's mother, Cynthia, that we know of as Cindy, was born June 5th, 1958 to Alexander and Shirley. She was the baby and the only daughter. Now, sources said that Alexander had a very serious work ethic, and it's no surprise why. He had also worked as a laborer, and it was long, hard hours. According to the book, Inside the Mind of Casey Anthony by Dr. Keith Ablow, and pause on him for a moment, by the time Alexander got home from work, he was, quote, bone tired. It was also said that Alexander was a very strict parent and had rather high expectations of his children. He ran a tight ship, but his wife, Shirley, was no pushover. In fact, according to one of Cindy's brothers, he said that their mother told his father what punishments to dole out, and he very much did as he was told. And that was their relationship. She was domineering, and he complied. She took good care of him and filled that mother wound that he had. Put a pin in that. Now, it appears that Shirley was the one that ran the house. Their children remembered Alexander having times where he would be relaxed and have a laugh with his kids until Shirley came around. And then he would almost be entirely silent. So what's Shirley's story? Well, her father had run off and abandoned her mother and siblings, and he basically had nothing to do with the kids. So Shirley's grandmother would babysit the children so her mother could work and try to support them all, because you don't have to abandon your children. Cindy's mother had a bit of a temper, and she didn't care if the neighbors heard. If the kids were even late to the dinner table, the mother would make sure that they knew that she was most displeased. Again, according to the book by Dr. Ablow, she came across as kind of a bully, making fun of people behind their backs, just all around not nice, just kind of a surface dweller. Cindy's older brothers had grown up when the family was quite poor, right? But by the time Cindy was born and coming right along, things weren't quite as tight. I mean, things were never super comfortable, to be sure, but just not quite as tight. Her brothers felt that she got preferential treatment and lovingly called her the princess, lovingly meaning sarcastic. But Cindy still grew up not entirely financially stable, and it was implied that she was teased for living in not the nicest rental house, and when she was a younger girl, she was described as incredibly shy and quiet. But as she matured, sources were all confident in saying that she became a bit of a control freak. The word micromanager was thrown around, and it's no wonder, really. I mean, look how her own mother treated everyone. It was just easier to make sure everything was controlled and subdued and quiet, very demure, seen and not heard. Cindy decided she wanted to train to be a nurse as her career. And over here on my channel, we respect the hell out of nurses. I'm just saying. So Cindy met George Anthony at the hospital that she wound up working in because she was caring for George's sister Ruth, who had been hospitalized. So let's get into George's history. So George Robert Anthony, I'm not 100% on that middle name, but that's what I found, was born on September 5th, 1951 in Ohio. Now his parents were Lee and Ruth Anthony, who themselves were married in 1945. George had a few siblings, brothers and sisters. Lee, who Casey's brother is named after, and this is George's father, finished school and joined the U.S. Army, serving in World War II. He was stationed in Japan and was awarded the Asiatic Pacific Theater Ribbon, Good Conduct Medal, Victory Medal, and Army of Occupation Medal Japan. So, rather impressive. So once Lee, George's father, got back from the war, he and Ruth began having children, and Lee opened up an auto shop and repair in Ohio. More about that again in a minute, but Lee was described as friendly. He didn't know a stranger. He sounded a little bit extroverted, but like in a good way. And that is literally all I could find out about George's family, other than I'm not naming his siblings, who in no way pertain to this story. So in the time I had, and considering the insane amount of crazy and unverifiable information and conspiracy theories there truly is about his family and the whole of the internet, or on the whole of the internet, I couldn't find anything about George's early years. But I want to give a quick disclaimer. Okay, so the book that I have referenced here did have verifiable and truthful factual information about timelines and names and dates. But in my most humble opinion, and my opinion alone, the author's theories and ideas about why all of this happened and the key players are some of the most far-reaching, completely illogical, and flat-out fantastical ideas I have heard yet, and I've gone through a lot. My brain is mush, and this guy was still way out there. I'm just saying. But if we can go off what people said about him, meaning George had just always been a little particular about his appearance. He liked his clothes perfectly ironed and his hair cut and styled just so. He took some pride in himself. He had always liked things clean and neat, especially with himself. There could be any number of reasons as to why he was that way, but I couldn't get enough info to form a confident opinion. But either way, he always uses feeling words and describes emotions as information, so this gives us a sense of his personality. And people described him as a little weak and perhaps broken. Their words, not mine. He latched onto Cindy as a mother figure, so I make some assumptions there might be something there, but I can't say for certain. And of course, Cindy would be attracted to a man who would give in to whatever it was that she wanted to do or say or plan, because her father sort of lived that way with her own mother. She grew up with that. It would be normal. But what I could find was when George was basically grown. So George was married before. His first marriage was to a woman named Terry in 1972 after she had become pregnant, and she would later describe him as a mama's boy. Terry's sister went as far as to call him the P word, like wussy, but more intense, right? So people that knew George back in the day said that he was an incredibly private person, not telling people much about himself. One guy actually said, quote, "No one around him knows George that well because there's nothing to know about George. At least there was nothing that he'd let you know." So he began working at the Trumbull County Sheriff's Department when he was just 22 years old. And though I couldn't find any specific instances of any issues with George's employment, some rando on Reddit mentioned that there was a scandal. I couldn't find one. Maybe you guys know of one. But, it seemed kind of common knowledge that he didn't really have that sort of important instinct that people need in law enforcement or any job where you have to be able to kind of really read people. But that seemed okay. Many said he was content in his uniform, driving around in the police cruiser, doing his job, investigating leads. He worked horrible crime scenes. He did his job. And as I said, Terry had become pregnant, thus the marriage, and George mentioned to her that he wanted to move south from Ohio to Orlando, Florida, but then she suffered a miscarriage before they left. So at this point, Terry had come to discover that George had a rather serious gambling problem, and that he had lied quite a bit to be able to continue his habit, so she divorced him. Only he was still technically married when he met Cindy. And yeah, Cindy lied to her parents about George's marital status at first, but I wouldn't really read too much into that. The two really did hit it off, and I'm sure, with the nature of her parents and their personalities, she thought it best that they didn't know since he was getting divorced. George and Cindy were married in March of 1981. Their first child, Lee Anthony, named after George's dad, was born in November of 1982, and then Casey was born in 1986, but the way their birthdays fell, they were just over 3 years apart. So George was still feeling, a bit restless and didn't want to work in law enforcement any longer, and decided to join the family business as his father, Lee, as I said, owned the auto sales and service business. The problem was that George just, again, didn't really have that kind of instinct when dealing with people who work in these kind of environments. He just didn't have it. He and his father butted heads quite a lot during his time working there. Now, it would seem that the butting of heads between Lee and George got heated enough that at one point his father shoved him. So George shoved him back with enough force that Lee stumbled through a plate glass window and had to get some level of medical attention. After this, not working in law enforcement and then working in the family business, just not working out really, it was said that George tried to unalive himself by ingesting an entire bottle of aspirin. The first attempt anyway. And I don't think anyone would argue that George was a passionate and emotional human being. And again, we'll touch on this a bit more later. So at some point, George's father even paid for him to take a course at Dale Carnegie, but studying what I couldn't find, but it didn't really help George. So with no real prospects and in near financial ruin, George, Cindy, and the two small children moved down to Orlando, Florida in 1989. Cindy went to work as a nurse for an orthopedic surgeon, and George found work at a security company. They bought a house, and they settled in. The takeaway from this information so far is that you get the sense that Cindy lives inside of her head from childhood conditioned ability to keep herself contained and controlled. George was more emotional, and he didn't mind putting that on display. So George and Cindy both told Dr. Phil, later of course, during their interviews, that their son Lee and daughter Casey had grown up quite close. That Lee had been that kind of protective big brother who looked after and watched over his kid sister, and that's always nice to hear. Lee himself, the brother, later alleged that when he and Casey were children, they loved animals, so they had pets like most families do. And when their pets would, pass on, George would bury the animals. Lee said, quote, "When our family pets would die, Dad would wrap the puppy in a blanket, put it in a trash bag, duct tape, and we would bury them," Lee said. So, foreshadowing much? But from the photos that I've seen, the childhood photos, Casey and Lee had average childhoods. Their parents had them participate in whatever extracurricular activities they wanted, gave them all they could afford within reason, but there was always a bit of tension in the home. But no really big stories in her youth, right? None that I found. So let's fast forward to Casey in high school. So a former classmate of Casey's said that Casey was a bit obnoxious and enjoyed being the center of attention. And as she got into high school, she wasn't shy about showing off her body or, say, the top of her thong. It was obvious she thrived on the attention of boys. In fact, one of her peers said that it was well known that Casey had already had a number of suitors in high school and that she was, quote, "not the take-home-to-mommy type." Her words, again, not mine. Another girl who knew her during high school said, quote, "She was extremely self-centered and overly confident, like she was trying to cover something up or put on some kind of front. I think deep down she was really insecure. She would always act like she was the shit and really liked to make more timid, shy people feel like losers. Again, this is all from my experiences with her or around her." End quote. Another acquaintance of theirs spoke about Lee being protective of his sister. They said, "We were all very familiar with her pattern, and Lee was a very good big brother. You didn't want him holding a grudge. You wouldn't want to offend Lee by pressing his little sister. He'd get up in your face." End quote. Sources also said that Lee suffered from depression. Now, I don't know that to be a complete fact, but it was mentioned more than once, which then makes it noteworthy. Bless Lee anyway. So while Casey was nearing the end of high school, the people around her began to notice even more of a change in her behavior. She started going to parties, going to the club, experimented with a bit of drugs, and began drinking. And while that isn't ideal, of course, it isn't wholly an uncommon set of behaviors in high schoolers. But this was also around the time that everyone just sort of knew Casey was a bullshitter, just completely full of it. She began lying about things, and not little white lies or exaggerations like everyone does when relaying some dramatic story, right? No. Lying for the sake of lying. No rhyme or reason in her lies, Just shit she made up. Nothing too big at this age, though, just little petty ones here and there, and that isn't common. And, Cindy and George were having some serious money problems around this time as well, and with that, tensions were mounting in the home. And who wants to be at home with parents that are fighting, be it loudly or not, when you're young and attractive and there are people out there willing to pay attention to you, for you to be the center of their world? And that's the key takeaway from this, right? Casey had to be the center of attention, and when attentions were pulled elsewhere, well, she couldn't cope with that. From what I read and watched and endured, in my educated opinion, but my opinion alone, she had sort of come to realize that she didn't know what to do with herself if she didn't have an audience, be it intimate or a whole crowd. There had to be drama. She became a pathological liar because she knew if people saw past her exterior looks, well, they'd realize just how empty she really was, and they would no longer want to be around her, and that kind of abandonment would simply not do. And so we might as well do our analysis up to this point. Now, there could be some small measure of intergenerational trauma there, though, on her mother's side. With two men of very recent ancestry abandoning their children or families, that's some serious stress. That might leave a scar on the telomeres, if you will. So one of the wives had to try to work and care for her children, which would have been difficult, and especially so for a woman way back then. But she still did it. Cindy's father had been abandoned by his father to live out his entire childhood in an orphanage. And we don't have to get into how that was most likely a very negative experience for him. His mother died when he was just a toddler. That's a mother wound. Toddlers are still attached to their mothers at the hip at that age, generally speaking. Alexander then married a woman who took complete control over the family, and he was fine with that. He clearly was a little beaten down by her mentally, but he was okay with handing over the control to her. Cindy's mother ruling of the family and being so domineering would be something that, while unintentional, Cindy would easily begin to emulate. It would depend on who she married, though, right? Under the perfect circumstances, she would have married someone solid with a great foundation that could take the reins and allow her to relax a bit. But no, she married George, who was again described as a mama's boy and a wuss, but the other word. He expressed himself through his emotions, and he can be dramatic. He wasn't good with money and not much of a ladder climber. So in other words, Cindy married a project, nearly her father, should I say, although George's work ethic was not really the same. And the only way to have the routine and peace and careful control that she really needed to have, she just had to micromanage. She knew most of this was going to fall on her. Cindy wasn't dumb. She's not dumb. She's highly intelligent. She just didn't get to marry Mr. Perfect Circumstances. It's that simple. You're going to hear me say it's literally that simple so many times, okay? So from court testimony to periodical interviews to books, all of the places that I went seemed to agree that while the family was not perfect, there was no physical abuse, and I don't believe emotional either that Casey or Lee had to endure from Cindy or George. The parents didn't really teach their children to be overly communicative when issues would arise. One gets the feeling that Cindy wasn't the mom that you could bring bad news to. There had been high expectations of Cindy in her youth, and that spilled into kind of her parenting her own kids. But when your teenagers don't feel that they can come to you to discuss issues that they are really struggling with because you are dismissive of their feelings because of their young age, then they won't come to you. We were all teenagers once. Every single one of us felt some level of insecurity during our teens. And rather than roll your eyes at your teen and spit some curt, dismissive line at them about, it's no big deal, you'll get over it, to shut them up, maybe you should listen. But I believe the parents were busy with themselves and their own work. Cindy as a nurse. We all know how hard that job is and the long hours. Cindy was exhausted. George worked and contributed, but he had his own demons with his gambling issues and causing family money problems. And rather than communicate, which is something neither parent learned how to do from their parents and therefore didn't teach their children to do, well, they all just assumed and tiptoed around each other. They provided a nice house, the parents did, for the kids to live in. Decent clothes, school activities, decent vehicles to ride in, just your very middle-class average childhood. Lee and Casey had a kitchen full of food to eat and warm beds to sleep in. The parents were fulfilling their duties, and they nailed that part of it. They nailed it. But they just didn't seem to feed their kids' emotional needs. But we get why. I think this is simply how it was. I read so much crap that really seemed like overblown works of fiction about intricate little blah, 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 and that's why this and that happened. No. I literally think it is just this simple. Period. What Casey and George should have been doing is getting out of their own heads and out of their own way to realize their daughter had begun displaying some, concerning behaviors and psychological problems. So I think we are beginning to see the early buds of a personality disorder in Casey. Although court experts said she didn't have one. Bullshit. So as Casey's high school graduation began looming in the near future, it came to Cindy's attention that Casey was a couple credits shy of being able to actually graduate. The school called Cindy, and that's how she found out. Or they sent a letter, one of the two. Casey lied, of course, but it was because she had skipped too much school, she didn't finish her work. Socialization and close interaction were far more important. And as far as I could find, she never finished high school. Ever. She would have graduated in May or June of 2004. So it's time to be a big girl now, right? And she goes, and she actually lands a rather lucky job with Kodak called Event Imaging Solutions, which was contracted through Universal in Florida. She did not work for Universal. I will save you the argument right now. She never worked for Universal. Ever. But her job with Kodak actually paid pretty well for such a young, very young adult, and she was an exemplary employee. She won those little office awards and whatnot, and good for her. If only she had only stayed on that path. Summer of 2004 turned into fall, and that turned into winter. It is believed that Casey became pregnant in December 2004. The story of Kaylee's conception and the main players have changed quite a bit, but I think Casey finally landed on a story she's sticking with, that she had been drugged and R-worded, assaulted at a house party. And if that actually happened, then bless of course, that would be quite traumatic. I don't really feel that story's true. It's just me. After high school, she wasn't the center of attention anymore. She got lucky and landed a decent job, making decent money. And as young as she was, she wanted to blow all of that money on partying, getting her perceived social status back up. She thirsted for the spotlight, and she usually always got it when she was out living it up. Because having to live inside of her own head and that empty husk of a shapely shell was uncomfortable. So she was pregnant. She said she just tried to pretend that she wasn't pregnant, and she certainly didn't tell anyone of her family. She kept it a secret. Now, sources differ when it comes to exactly how far along Casey was in her pregnancy before she came out to her parents that she was pregnant. I've seen she waited until she was 7 months along, but Cindy told Dr. Phil it was 5 months. But when both of her parents found out, they asked her why she waited so long to tell them, and she didn't have an answer. And yet another rather confusing issue in this household is that Brother Lee and Casey shared a bathroom, and he saw her midsection and asked both his sister and his mother if she was pregnant, and they both told him that she was not. Why lie to Lee? I mean, okay, Casey lied constantly, but why did Cindy lie about it too? I think Cindy was afraid of the reaction of others, that her daughter was pregnant when she was so young and single. I mean, she didn't finish high school, So Casey did have a boyfriend at the time, but to save you the energy, he was not the father. Casey initially did not want the baby and wanted to give her up for adoption, but Cindy wouldn't hear of it. Then within a couple of weeks of giving birth, someone finally told Lee the truth, and he was so hurt that he had been lied to and left out that he didn't go to the hospital when Kaylee was born. I can understand that. I mean, that would be hurtful. Now, I read that George and Cindy were in the room when Kaylee was born. Cindy, I understand. And I don't want to make things awkward if fathers are in the room watching their daughters give birth, but I personally find that a little odd. If George was in there watching Casey give birth, well, that seems super awkward. And then I read once Kaylee was born, the infant was handed to Cindy, not Casey. Now, I don't know if this is true, and I certainly hope it isn't, but something tells me there is some truth to it. And if that is the case, then Casey didn't get that instant chance to begin bonding with her newborn, and that's not good either. But I don't want to give Casey Anthony even a drop of credit where it is not due. She was the center of attention, all eyes on her. She was happy. Kaylee went home with Casey to Cindy and George's house to get settled in. All sources spoke about how excited both of her parents were to be grandparents. Neither dug very hard at finding out who the father was because they didn't care. It's just that simple. They were just happy to have a baby in the house. Again, as much insanity as I read and listened to about some complex scheme to take the baby away from Casey, all the way to the depravity of George being the father. He wasn't, by the way, that's disgusting. Again, I believe it to be literally that simple. The baby was a very welcome distraction from their own lives that were about to begin crashing around them. Kaylee was born on August 9th, 2005. So only 3 months later, 3 months, George and Cindy decided to separate. So Cindy had uncovered the fact that George had blown a lot of money on online gambling, tens of thousands of dollars that they did not have, and it caused quite a ruckus. In November 2005, George moved out of the home. I don't know if Cindy ordered him out or not, but my guess is that she probably did. Casey was taking care of Kaylee, though, and things returned to some semblance of quiet. And Casey, of course, wasted zero time. She got right back into the scene because, well, she didn't know what to do with herself if she wasn't filling that empty husk of a surface dweller bullshit within her. So baby Kaylee spent a great deal of time with her grandparents, as we can all imagine, probably most of her time with them. And Casey was okay with that as long as no one pointed that out to her, right? Criticism? Oh no, that would never be tolerated. And then sometime in the spring of 2006, for reasons unknown, well, Casey just stopped going to work at Kodak and was fired for job abandonment in April of 2006. But she could still go out. She still had money to party with. So where was that money coming from? Well, it turns out she was stealing money from Cindy, $20 here and there. And then in June 2006, Casey found out that her father was going to be moving back into the home. Her parents had in fact reconciled. They decided to try to work through it and move past to preserve their marriage. Kaylee would turn 1 year old 2 months later. Now, George said that in early 2007 is when he really began to notice a shift in Casey, that the things that she would tell her father just didn't add up. And I read that apparently Casey was not very happy when her father had moved back into the house. He had originally wanted them to sell the house, split the profits, and go their separate ways. And according to Cindy, well, this made Casey feel as if he were kicking her and Kaylee out, or that is how she felt about it when speaking with Cindy at the time. George said that he noticed Casey wouldn't be out of place or an area that she would tell him she would be. He began to notice that money was missing from places within the home and out of his wallet because she began stealing from him too, big time. She stole from Cindy's mother, of all people, her elderly grandmother. She didn't care. Later in 2007, that same year, Cindy found out that Casey had stolen over $4,500 from her credit card. And then 2007 turned into 2008. Kaylee was now 2 years old. Getting completely fed up with Casey's thieving and lies and not growing the fuck up to be the mother that she needed to be, well, Cindy threatened to ask Casey to take Kaylee and leave. Now, you and I both know that that would have never happened. Cindy mistakenly thought that that might metaphorically sober Casey up and she'd quit with her dumb shit, but no, it actually backfired. In May, Casey had been discussing looking for a house to buy or rent with a girlfriend of hers. But do not forget that Casey still has no job at this point. So June 15th, 2008, Cindy took toddler Kaylee with her to visit her father, Alexander, in the nursing home he was in. He had moved to Florida, too. It was Father's Day, the next day. George testified that he saw Casey leave the house with Kaylee around lunchtime. Both of the girls had backpacks. This is the last confirmed sighting of Kaylee. She would not be seen alive again. She was 2 months shy of turning 3 years old. So from 4:11 p.m., this is important, from 4:11 p.m. that afternoon until 4:25, so 14 minutes, Casey was frantically calling several people. She tried her mother several times, as well as others. And then silence. At around 6 p.m., Casey showed up to her current boyfriend's house without Kaylee, and the couple went to Blockbuster to rent movies to watch. Casey spent the night there, and remember, still, she has no job. So there's no need to go over every single detail with a fine-tooth comb. We all know what happened. Allegedly, of course. So when Cindy and George saw Casey without her little girl, well, they asked her where Kaylee was. Casey told them that she was with a woman with a Latina name, but called her Zanny the nanny. And of course, one of the death theories is that Casey accidentally over-medicated Kaylee with Xanax or cold medicine or something, so that she could go party and not have to take care of her. She would just sleep. It's just a theory. Xanax being the nanny, Zanny the nanny, Xanax, right? You get it. Except no one under that name that she gave to her parents and later the authorities lived at the apartment complex that Casey couldn't even point out to be this mystery woman's specific apartment. We all know that that shit was a lie. June 17th, the day after George was the last person to see Kaylee alive, Casey drove to her parents' house and backed into the driveway and into the garage, which is something she never did, ever. She was parked in there from 2:30 p.m. that afternoon until 4:30 p.m. She is still telling her parents that Kaylee is with Zanny the nanny. She asked a neighbor to borrow a shovel for 1 hour and then drove her car out of the garage and left. So the next day, Casey told her mother that she had some work conference to go to and that she would be taking Kaylee with her along with Zanny the nanny to care for her while she attended meetings. Lies. All lies. According to crime timelines, during the supposed 6-day trip, Cindy Anthony received no contact from Casey, despite leaving multiple voicemail messages. When Casey finally returned her calls, she told Cindy that Zanny had been in a serious car accident, leaving them stuck in the hospital, which prevented her and Kaylee from coming home. Casey got busted by her father stealing gas out of the gas cans that he kept in the garage for the lawnmower and various things. She was said to have brought the gas cans back and then cussed her father out for calling attention to her theft. I mean, it's the unpredictable multiple mood swings for me. June 25th. Kaylee was now missing for 9 days, and Casey told a friend of hers that her car smelled like, quote, something had died in it. Keep in mind that this is June in Florida, where it gets unbearably hot and humid. 2 days after that, Casey abandoned her car in a parking lot. She called her current boyfriend to come and pick her up, and that night, she went out clubbing. I mean, had a grand time by the looks of the photos that we all saw during her trial. June 30th, with Kaylee missing now for 14 days, a fortnight. Her car got towed from the parking lot. Cindy began calling Casey and demanding to know where that baby was. July 1st, Casey told her mother that Kaylee was with another babysitter again. She still has no job. What the fuck is she doing all day then? Correct. Whatever she wanted. July 3rd, Cindy drove to Casey's old place of employment where she had been under the impression Casey still worked at, only to find out that that was not the case and Kaylee wasn't there. Casey told her that they were in Jacksonville. This is the day that Cindy created a MySpace page about her granddaughter being missing. So let's pause for a moment, okay? Right here is where I know you're beginning to think that Cindy should have called the cops, and you're right. But put yourself in her shoes. Now, why on earth would she ever think or entertain the notion that Casey had done anything to Kaylee? I mean, sure, Casey was a pathological liar and a thief and on, but I just don't think it really occurred to Cindy that Kaylee might actually be in any danger or be truly missing because she was with her mother. My guess is that she created that page out of worry and frustration and impulse to again try to force Casey to bring that baby home. I think it could literally be that simple. 4th of July. Kaylee's now been missing for 18 days. Don't worry though. Casey was fine. She was at a lake party with friends watching fireworks, happy as she could be. Casey told her mother that she was having car troubles up in Jacksonville, so she wouldn't be home with Kaylee for 10 days, returning on the 14th. So for the next few nights, Casey was again out clubbing and partying. Good times had by all, not a care in the world for this young mother. July 15th, so 30 days since anyone had last seen Kaylee. And Cindy and George found out that Casey's car had been towed via a letter and that the car was nowhere near where Casey said she was. Cindy left a message for Casey that shit was getting real and she had better contact them. Then they went and retrieved her car. The parents opened the trunk of the car and both smelled the horrid stench of decomposition. Cindy called 911 multiple times, growing more and more scared. Cindy decided to contact a friend and former co-worker of Casey's to inquire about Casey and Kaylee. The friend confirmed that Casey had never been in Jacksonville, but was instead staying at her boyfriend's apartment in Orlando, right? So Cindy drove to that apartment where she found and confronted Casey about where Kaylee was. Casey reluctantly agreed to take her to Kaylee, and the two set off in a car. But then she refused to say where they were going, just having her mother drive around aimlessly. Cindy had finally had enough and called the police on her daughter during that drive. This is when Casey tells everyone that Zanny the nanny has in fact kidnapped Kaylee after she dropped her off at Zanny the nanny's apartment. So the police get involved and she is ultimately arrested for lying to the police about, basically everything. They busted her lying about the fact that she worked at the literal Universal Studios. She ran with that lie so hard that she had them take her there. And she walked around greeting people as if they would even know who the fuck she was, and demanded to see her non-existent supervisor before she finally fessed up. So when the police asked her why she didn't report her daughter missing for 31 days, her response was sort of a detached, quote, "I've been looking for her and have gone through other resources to try to find her, which was stupid." End quote. What? Cindy then told the police that Casey's car smelled like, quote, "There's been a dead body in the damn car." I can still hear her saying that in my mind.
"Something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the car."
But tests confirmed a decomposing, once living thing had indeed been in her car. A cadaver dog signaled that it was human decomposition. On August 11th, 2008, a man by the name of Roy Kronk, I know, but he was a meter reader, and he contacted the sheriff's office about a suspicious kind of bag that he saw now that the entire world knew that Kaylee was missing. That shit spread like wildfire. But the bag was not really investigated. 2 days later, Roy called the authorities again about the bag he saw out in the brush, an overgrown, marshy area not too far from the Anthony family home. And again, he was told that it was just trash. In September, computer searches revealed that Casey had looked up chloroform and neck breaking in March of 2008. The police investigated Casey's internet searches, including searches for, again, chloroform, neck breaking, and household weapons. She Googled that shit. In October, forensic reports from an examination of Casey's car were released, and it was noted that a hair strand discovered in the trunk was, quote, "microscopically similar to those found on Kaylee's brush and showed characteristics of apparent decomposition." Additionally, an air sample from the trunk was found to contain chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. So Roy would later testify about the moment he discovered Kaylee's skull on December 11th, 2008. So the months had gone by since he first reported seeing that bag. He said, quote, "I was standing behind it, so I was looking at it from behind. I still didn't think it was real, so I gently took it," which is a meter reader stick, "and put it in the right eye socket. That was really horrific thing for me to find, obviously." So the toddler was found in a wooded area off the suburban drive near the Anthony family home. Along with the toddler's remains were duct tape, a Winnie the Pooh blanket, canvas bags, black plastic trash bags, and a Gatorade bottle with a syringe. The duct tape had been put over where Kaylee's mouth and nose would have been had she not been dumped like a piece of garbage out in some overgrowth. She was so far decomposed that they could not establish a cause of death. So, May 24th, 2011, Casey Anthony's trial began, and we all know how it ended. She was found not guilty. She was found not guilty of murdering her baby girl. And there really is no need to hash over all of the courtroom drama, right? We've all heard it. How could they find her not guilty? She later tried to say that her father George had, again, R-worded her repeatedly in her youth, and that Lee, her brother, had also put hands on her in an inappropriate way. She said that George was the cause of Kaylee's death. So after some years, George and Cindy took lie detector tests, where George was asked numerous times about inappropriate actions towards children or his daughter and granddaughter, to which he denied. And you know what? He passed the polygraph. The man that conducted the test was a seasoned polygrapher who knew what he was doing. The results are trustworthy. The 4 guys from the behavior panel all agreed he was a good one. And in no way do I think George had anything to do with Kaylee's death, nor do I think he put a hand on either girl in any nefarious way. But the media likes to point out a small hiccup when he was asked if he had a hand in at least knowing where Kaylee's remains had been, but they determined that he was upset because he felt that he knew Casey had done something to that baby and left her somewhere close. So it wasn't deception. It was just him feeling guilt. So here's where I stand. Is there some family history of abandoning children? In a sense, yes, through her mother's side. But it was generations before Casey. Is there some level of mental defect or personality disorders running through that family? Maybe, but again, I'm telling you that it is this simple. Her parents were busy with their own shit that they were dealing with. They should have paid more attention to her. They didn't, but they weren't shitty parents. She just didn't like that she wasn't the center of attention after she grew out of childhood. George had his own demons that did financially affect the family, and he's a bit of a diva, but he never mistreated the children. And neither did Cindy. Were they the warmest, most doting parents on the planet? No. But they still showered her with attention and everything she needed. Again, she was a part of school functions and they attended. She never really wanted for anything, and yet, that simply wasn't good enough. I believe that Cindy and George thought they were doing most everything correctly and with love when it came to Casey, though they did probably drop the ball on having their little family be sort of communicative, right? But there was no domestic violence, perhaps parents squabbling and so on. She had an older brother who loved her. She was bright. Casey was bright. She was beautiful. Her parents fully supported her and Kaylee without waiver, even though Casey was being a blatant, irresponsible trampoline. But she was empty. There's nothing of real substance to her but reactionary mood swings and lies. And she is still empty. And always will be. She is an empty husk of a pretend human walking around with no sense of herself. She is what we call an NPC, a non-playable character. When she isn't putting herself out on display with her shitty attitude and delusions of advocacy, she's nothing. She's nothing. Occam's razor says that most often the simplest answer is the answer, and I feel very strongly that that is the case here. Though she was found innocent, we all know, right? We all know what she fucking did. We might not have all of the details about how she did it, be it an accident or intentional. She committed what we just learned about, unwanted child filicide. Once the newness wore off from having a baby and no one was oohing and awing over her anymore, and clearly her parents had taken over most of the child care for Kaylee because Casey was too busy to be bothered, she had to up the ante to get more spotlight time. And boy, did she. Her little shit-eating grins in court just made me violent. Now, I stand on business that she is, at the very minimum, borderline personality disorder, and I'd wager there's more, but I'll leave it at that. Just like Megan Boswell. Life nearly imitated art, only, thankfully, Megan's jury had the good sense the universe gave them to find her guilty. I believe wholeheartedly that my own mother is very much a borderline personalitied mother. My mother also prioritized her social life and being in the bars and drinking and having me in the dive bars with her as a child over my mental and physical well-being. Mine left me with babysitters that put their hands on me in all ways that you are imagining. She married a few alcoholics and she buried husband number 8 a few years ago. Mine also pretended to be this stellar, attentive parent and loved to brag about her mothering when behind closed doors, well, it was something else entirely. But I was to be seen and not heard, right? Conditioned to endure her wrath. And while I don't really think Casey physically abused Kaylee, she was in the way of the life Casey felt she deserved to live as well. So I take Kaylee's murder a little personally, and I'm not going to apologize for that. If Casey had given a damn about her baby girl, she would have come clean. She should have left Kaylee with her parents. But a borderline's pride is vicious, and Casey was no different. Her emptiness and insecurity played into her need for the spotlight and the adoration of the fans that she envisioned she had, all the while being wholly unable to think outside of her own sense of self-preservation. Kaylee was a big inconvenience, and though Casey was found not guilty, I'm saying that plainly, it is my belief that Casey murdered that baby. And that's it. I will die on this hill with Nancy Grace beside me and the rest of you. I have zero patience and understanding for mothers who cannot sacrifice and give that shit up for their kids. Your kids should be your whole world. Fuck that bitch. I hope Casey gets everything she deserves.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer. And whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time, and then in the early 80s they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.